Planet Word was founded on the simple idea that words matter.
Planet Word is a celebration of the living English language.
It raises your awareness that language is there around you all the time.
Fun, playful, unexpected. Everywhere you turn a corner, there's something that's going to catch your imagination.
It's a playground for potential and a playground for possibility, right?
Here we are in Washington, D.C., a city filled with museums. But until Planet Word was founded, there was not a single museum devoted to words and language.
Language is the most important function that we all use because I think it's actually what builds culture.
The content is extremely diverse and we meet people where they are, and we don't require anyone to bring any knowledge in order to have a wonderful time here.
In this museum, you are going to paint with words. You are going to talk with a wall of 1,000 three-dimensional words that's going to tell you stories. You're going to sing karaoke. You're going to disappear into a secret hidden room in a library. These are not your usual museum experiences.
This brings together the fascination with technology and the fascination with language.
Our mission is to inspire and renew a love of words, language, and reading in people of all ages.
There isn't a museum anywhere like it in the world, being able to have fun and still learn at the same time.
Planet Word can inspire people to love reading. It's more than just text on a page.
This is one of the greatest experiences that I've had, and I recommend it to any and everybody, no matter what age.
Places that humanize the book, humanize the reading experience, that gives me tremendous hope. And it's the coolest experience in the world.
I hope that visitors leave here inspired and motivated to use their superpower, their words, in ways that maybe they didn't imagine they could before coming here.
So good evening. Welcome to Planet Word. So glad you can be here. I hope you had an opportunity, if you haven't already, to look around either before you came in or some other time. It's really, as you can tell from the video, just a real unprecedented, exquisite, terrific experience. I'm Stefanie Sanford. I'm one of the founding board members of Planet Word. I was just saying to Emily, I believe since we were drawing it on napkins, I've had a chance to be involved in this. And it's really a labor of love. I've told people that I think, Anne, this is a love letter to language. It's just been a real honor to be a part of it. I'm excited to welcome you all to the third in a series of these curated conversations about reading. The first was a screening of The Right to Read here in the museum. The second, we did a virtual discussion with on Reading for Our Lives with Maya Smart. A really spirited, wonderful, aimed at parents, highly practical book. And so thank you to Ashley Meadows and Caitlin Miller. I can't see you quite with the lights. Can we just give an applause for putting together this terrifically curated set of conversations. And tonight is our third. So a special thanks to our founder and CEO, Anne Friedman, and who's really the inspiration for this discussion. A former reading teacher, and really brings that passion and that sensibility and that reverence for the word and for teaching reading. Now, as a museum, we don't directly teach reading, but part of the mission really is to engage the broader public in this critical conversation, and particularly right now. And so one way to do that is to have events like this and bring terrific people here to be able to talk to you about it. So here's what we're gonna do. I'll introduce Emily, and then we'll hear from her on her journey to really understand struggling readers and what to do about it. I'll join her on stage for a discussion, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions, and we'll wrap at about 7:45. So with that, let's get started. Welcome, Emily. She's held a number of roles in public media over the last 2 decades, and she is now the Senior Education Correspondent at American Public Media. She has deeply covered the science of reading, and has produced one of the most bracing and talked about podcasts in education, I would argue, maybe podcasts ever. Yes. And her reporting has won awards from the American Education Research Association for being able to write about research, and from the Education Writers Association for doing a public service for covering these topics. And it seems to me, in sort of listening to this and even just talking to her now, that her superpower seems to be translating dense and complex findings into compelling stories. Compelling and actionable narratives. And I think about that at a time of polarization in our politics, polarization in our media, even, and the intensity of social media. What you're doing is absolutely countercultural. And thank you for that. And now I do have a confession to make. I am not a podcast person. I have wondered what all of the fuss was about. I certainly have friends, and they have been very opinionated about it, all these different apps. But I don't really have a podcast real estate in my life. Right? I don't commute. I like to walk out, in green and in the quiet. But after about the fifth person said, "You have to listen to this podcast," I got out my AirPods and I went on a walk, and 15 minutes in, I couldn't take my ears off Sold a Story. I have not binged anything like that since my husband and I discovered Ted Lasso in the deep depths of the pandemic. Ted Lasso, that's it. And it's interesting. So it's sophisticated and fair reporting on this super complicated research topic. But it's made accessible through storytelling. And it's a compelling use of the podcast form. I'm a newbie to it, so I'm thinking a lot in a meta way about the use of this form. And then every education conference that I've been to, everybody is talking about it. Now, some people say there's an accusation that it just reignited the reading wars. And others have said, yay, reignite because this is a long overdue conversation and discussion about what really works. Series made a case for phonics and called into question some very popular and widespread other kinds of curricula. And now, of all things, in many states, we're in legislative session season, a bunch of policymakers are taking action. Then is that good or scary? Right? But in my entire career, I have never seen an act of journalism animate this much debate, this much legislative action, this sort of productive, important debate than Sold a Story. So we're excited to host this discussion. We're thrilled to have you here and hope to see more of you. This conversation, it is central to our mission. It's close to our founder's heart. It's critical to the success of young people and fundamental to the health of our democracy. Now that, my friends, is a discussion. Emily, welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about myself and what I've learned. I'm really happy to be a part of this series of events. I remember reading an article in the Washington Post, it was in 2019, about a new museum that was opening dedicated to language, and I thought, that is so brilliant. Of course we need a museum for that. I'm there. And then of course the pandemic happened and no one could come for a long time, but finally this museum opened to the public, and I came here for the first time about a year ago with my mom, who's sitting over there, and my younger son, that's my older one right there next to her. But we came about a year ago, and it was just, I loved it. Absolutely love this place. I love language, I love words, I always have. When I was a toddler, my uncle lived in our attic, and he was in film school, and he filmed me when I was about 2 or 3 years old, and he noted that I seemed to know a lot of words. And he asked me, where do words come from? And I reportedly said, they come from the stars. We've never been able to find this film, so I cannot be fact-checked at this point. But words have always, I think, come pretty easily to me, and learning how to read came pretty easily to me too. So this is me in first grade. You can guess what year it is, and you can say later. So I'll tell you at the end. But like I said, reading, I think, came pretty easily to me. I don't remember a whole lot about learning how to read. I don't remember it being difficult. I think it came pretty easily to my kids, too. I have 2 boys. The older one over there, he's 23. This is their first day of school. They're New England sports fans, sorry, and we had a hard night last night with the Celtics. So this was their first day of school when the little one was starting kindergarten and the big one over there was starting 3rd grade. So it was a long time ago. They're now 23 and 20. And when my kids went off to school, near here, I live in Maryland, I didn't think much about how they were going to be taught how to read. And I certainly didn't think about whether they were going to be taught to read. I assumed that they would. And like I said, they did learn how to read without much trouble. This is my younger son. This is just a few months into kindergarten, and he's reading a chapter book, Magic Treehouse. And I really don't know how he learned to do that. It just sort of seemed to happen. And school was a really good experience for this kid, and it was for my older son too, and it was for me. I loved school. And I think it had something to do with the fact that reading came pretty easily to us. But here's the thing that I've learned. Reading does not come easily to quite a few people. And far more people than I realized. And it doesn't have to do with intelligence, right? There are really, really smart people who struggle to learn how to read. They can learn to read, but they need someone to teach them how to do it. So I didn't know this really at all until a few years ago. So let me tell you a little bit more about myself. That's me. I've been an education reporter since 2008. My bio says that I've been a reporter for 20 years, but really it's about 30 at this point. I have to update that. So in my education reporting, I have been particularly interested in 2 things. How family income generally and how poverty in particular affect educational opportunities and outcomes. And I've also been really interested in how people learn and the findings from cognitive science and how those play out or not in classrooms. So almost all the reporting that I did was focused on secondary and post-secondary education. This photo of me in the classroom is from 2008, and I'm with little kids in a preschool class, and the very first reporting project that I did was about preschool. But then I didn't do much of anything at all on early or elementary education until I got interested in how kids learn to read about 6 years ago. And that's when I realized that early reading instruction is really where it's at if you're interested in educational equity, opportunity, and how people learn. So this is the very first reporting project that I did about this reading stuff. It's called Hard to Read. It's a podcast episode and also an article. And it's about why students with dyslexia have a hard time getting the help they need in school. Now, I knew virtually nothing about dyslexia. I didn't even think I knew anyone with dyslexia. Of course I do. We all do. You might not know it. But I really didn't know very much about it at all. But I was hearing the same story, like really the same story over and over again from parents all over the country. I started talking to parents in Maryland and I thought, whoa, Maryland's got a problem. And then I was talking to people in Michigan and Massachusetts and California and Texas and Florida, and I thought, whoa, there is something going on here. The parents are telling me the same story over and over again. And here's how the story goes. Our child started school and we knew something wasn't quite right. We went to the teacher and the teacher said, don't worry, make sure you read lots of books to him, everything's gonna be fine. But reading was really hard for him. He just didn't seem to get it. We went to the first grade teacher and the teacher said, don't worry, all kids learn differently, he'll pick it up. But he didn't seem to be making a whole lot of progress. By second grade, he was avoiding reading. He was telling us he didn't want to go to school. And the teacher said, we just haven't found your child the right book yet. And it went on and on like this. The parents saying, something's not right. The school saying, don't worry, it'll all come together in time. Don't worry about it. And here's what eventually happens if the family has time and money, especially money. They pay for private testing. This private testing usually costs thousands of dollars. They might pay for private tutoring, which quickly adds up to more thousands of dollars. They might even hire an attorney or an educational consultant or both to help them fight for what their child needs in school. And all of this is not just expensive, really expensive. It's exhausting and frustrating, and it's really, really hard. And the parents begin to realize that their child may never get what he needs in school. Or he's not going to get it fast enough, because now he's 8 or 9 or 10 years old and he does not like school. And he has fallen behind in other subjects because he can't read very well. Maybe he's beginning to act out in school, or maybe this is manifesting as depression and anxiety and withdrawal. And this is when, if they have the resources, the family might pull their child out of public school. Maybe they homeschool him, or maybe the family figures out a way to come up with the tens of thousands of dollars that it can cost to send a child to a specialized private school, if there's a good private school nearby that they can get into. And that's a big if. So here's the situation that we're in this country. If you can come up with the money to pay for it, you can probably find a way for your struggling reader to be taught how to read. But if you don't have the money and your child is not learning to read in school, what do you do? The equity implications of this are really stunning. If you're from a low or even a moderate income family, there's really no safety net. There's no backup if you're not being taught to read in school. As one mom put it to me, a mom in Maryland actually, she said, getting help for a struggling reader is a rich man's game. So we're talking about reading, which is the most basic and fundamental skill and the foundation upon which academic learning gets built. That's a rich man's game. So how did that happen? How was it allowed to continue? So this led me to the next reporting project, which is called Hard Words. So this was in 2018, also a podcast episode and an article. And Hard Words is about core classroom reading instruction. So not what needs to be done for struggling readers in particular, but rather what do all children need to learn to become good readers? Now it turns out there's decades of scientific research on this. And the bottom line from all of this research is what kids with dyslexia need to learn to become good readers is not substantially different from what all kids need to learn to become good readers. Kids with dyslexia will need a more intensive dose of a certain kind of instruction, but all kids can benefit from the kind of instruction that kids with dyslexia desperately, desperately need. So I just mentioned the scientific research on reading. I didn't know anything about this research. It's the parents of kids with dyslexia who informed me that there was a huge body of research on reading and how it works. So let me just pause for 1 second on this phrase that people are talking about a lot now. So the science of reading, right? What is that? So here's the definition from Mark Seidenberg. He's a cognitive scientist who has been studying reading since the 1970s. So the science of reading is a body of basic research in developmental psychology, educational psychology, cognitive science, and cognitive neuroscience on reading, one of the most complex human behaviors, and its biological bases. This research has been conducted for decades in the United States and around the world. The research has important implications for helping children to succeed, but it has not been incorporated in how teachers are trained for the job or how children are taught. So I'm going to give you a very brief and very high-level summary of some of the things scientists have figured out about how children learn to read, just some of the big ideas. Then I'm going to tell you about how reading is being taught in many schools and how that instruction conflicts with what scientists have learned. So to understand how children learn to read, a really good place to begin is with something called the simple view of reading. And I'm sure some of you have seen this before. Really important to note here, the simple view of reading does not say that reading is simple. To the contrary, reading is very, very complex. The simple view of reading is a simple model to understand a complex process. So the simple view of reading was first proposed back in 1986. I was in high school at the time, so there's a clue in terms of when that picture was taken. So it was first proposed by these two scientists, Philip Goff and William Tunmer. And they proposed this model because they were trying to clarify the role of decoding in reading comprehension. So everyone agrees that the goal of reading is to comprehend text. Everyone agrees on that. The question is, how does a little kid get there? So the simple view says that reading comprehension is the product, not the sum, the product of two things. So one is your ability to decode the words. You see the letter string R-E-A-D-I-N-G, and you know that that string of letters represents the word reading. The other part of the equation is your language comprehension. So that is your ability to understand spoken language. So we're not talking about your ability to read text. Language comprehension is your ability to understand meaning when someone is talking to you or reading out loud to you. So for example, when someone says to you, she is reading the book, you know what the verb means in that sentence. You know what she's doing. So the simple view says that if you have really good language comprehension skills, but zero decoding skills, your reading comprehension will be 0, because 0 times anything is 0. Now, the simple view says that if you have really good decoding skills, but very poor language comprehension skills, you just don't know the meaning of that many words in spoken language, well, your reading comprehension is not going to be very good either. So let's look at how this applies to learning how to read. So most kids entering school have very little when it comes to the decoding part of that equation. They have 0 or close to 0 when it comes to the D in the simple view of reading equation. But they do have something when it comes to the language comprehension part of the equation. In other words, when children enter school, they know the meaning of words, but they don't know how to decode those words yet. So this is why people familiar with the science of reading call for an emphasis on phonics instruction in the early grades. Because if the goal is to get to reading comprehension, and you have a bunch of 5- and 6-year-olds before you who have language comprehension skills but virtually no decoding skills, what do you need to do to help those children get to reading comprehension? You need to help those children develop decoding skills. What you want to focus on with little kids is getting their decoding skills up to their level of language comprehension. Now, the simple view clearly shows that focusing only on decoding would be a very, very big mistake, because it's only part of the equation. It's only half the equation here. Now, the simple view, it's only part of the equation. And as everyone knows, as I'm sure you all know, there's lots of research that shows this, and I'm sure you know it from personal experience, whether you're a parent or teacher or both. Kids come into school with very different language comprehension skills. Some kids know the meaning of lots and lots and lots of words. There are some very precocious 5-year-olds out there when it comes to language ability, right? But some kids, for a variety of reasons, have far smaller vocabularies. Maybe they don't speak English at home. That's one reason they might have a smaller vocabulary. So reading instruction that aligns with the simple view has to focus on the language comprehension part of the equation too. So that means lessons and activities that expand children's oral vocabularies. So a few years ago, I was in a 1st grade classroom in California that was deliberately aligned with the simple view of reading. And what I saw was explicit phonics instruction in one part of the reading instruction, with kids broken into small groups depending on the level of their decoding skills. And then another part of the reading instruction was explicit vocabulary lessons and lots of reading aloud by the teacher. So the words that the kids had learned were posted on cards all over the classroom, and they included words like gigantic, extraordinary, neighborly, and ridiculous. So those are not words that the vast majority of 1st graders are going to be able to decode, and they shouldn't be expected to. But these 1st graders were learning the pronunciation and meaning of these words so that when they're able to decode them, they'll know what the words mean. Every single child in this class in California spoke English as a second language. None of them spoke English at home, and for some of them, English was a 3rd language. So as I said, the simple view was proposed as a theoretical model back in 1986, and the basics of this model have been confirmed over and over and over again since. This theory, this idea, has stood the test of time. The simple view is helpful because it disentangles some of the stuff that has been most contentious in the debates about reading. So in what's known as the whole language view and the balanced literacy view more recently, the focus right from the start of reading instruction should be on getting kids to focus on the meaning of what they're reading. Whole language and balanced literacy are meaning emphasis approaches to reading instruction, as opposed to what's known as a code emphasis approach, which emphasizes decoding skills at the beginning of reading instruction. So early reading instruction that aligns with the science is a code emphasis approach so that kids can get to meaning. Everyone agrees that that is the goal. The question is, how does a little kid get there? So now let me turn to how children are being taught in many American schools. Kids are being taught strategies for figuring out written words. Strategies like this. This came home in the backpack with a kid in Massachusetts. His mother sent it to me. These are all strategies for kids to use when they're reading and they come to a word they don't know. And these strategies are sensible enough, they seem to make a lot of sense. You get to a word you don't know, what can you do? You can look at the picture to try to figure out what the word might be. You don't want to completely guess, so you can look at the first letter. You can look at how the word begins. This is going to narrow your choices, right? You can check to see if you were right. You can reread the sentence using the word, see if the sentence makes sense. And if you're stuck, you can just skip the word and move on. Hopefully, you can get the gist of the sentence anyway. So what's up with this? What's the idea about how reading works that these strategies are based on? What's the idea about how kids learn to read? That's what I wanted to understand. And it turns out these strategies are rooted in a theory, an idea about reading and how it works. So this theory became known as 3-cueing. Not everyone calls it that. The idea is that readers use different kinds of information or cues or clues to identify the words as they're reading. This theory was first proposed back in the 1960s, and the basic idea behind the cueing theory is that readers don't have to sound out written words to know what they are. They can sound out the words, but they don't have to, because there are other strategies they can use to figure out the words. They could do things like look at the first letter, use the context, think of something that makes sense, right? The problem is, this is not the way that skilled readers read. This is not the way you do it. So At a Loss for Words is the reporting project I did in 2019, and it's about this cueing theory. It's about this idea and how this theory and the word reading strategies that are based on this theory became foundational in reading curriculum, assessments, and intervention programs that are popular in American schools that say they use a balanced literacy approach to teaching reading. But this cueing theory, as I said, isn't right. It's not how skilled reading works. Cognitive scientists first started to show this back in the 1970s. Skilled readers do not use cues and context to identify words as they're reading. In fact, what scientists figured out is that that is actually the way that struggling readers read. Struggling readers often have a hard time with word identification. Too many of the words they come across are little mysteries, series of letters that they don't know and can't quite figure out. So they use a bunch of other strategies to try to figure out what the words say. When they come to a word they don't know, they look at the first letter, first few letters, they think of a word that makes sense. In other words, they use context to try to come up with a word that fits. And when they can't figure out what a word is using context clues, they skip the word. And often they can get the gist of what they're reading this way. But what cognitive scientists figured out is that a key difference between skilled readers and unskilled readers is that skilled readers can immediately and accurately recognize words. They don't guess or predict or use context they don't need to. Skilled readers know tens of thousands of words instantly on sight. In fact, if you're a skilled reader, your brain has gotten so good at reading words that you process the word book faster than you process a picture of a book. So how did your brain get so good at that? It's really fascinating because it turns out we are not born with brains that are really prepared to do this really well. We can get really good at reading, but it's not a natural process. It's not something that happens like learning how to talk if you're surrounded by spoken language. So how do you get those words into your brain? How do you become a reader? It happens through this process known as orthographic mapping. And I think knowing just a little teeny bit about this is really key to understanding why teaching kids how to decode the words is so important, and also for understanding why teaching kids the cueing strategies that I talked about is not a good idea. So here is a quick and simplified explanation of orthographic mapping. It is basically the process we use to store printed words in our long-term memory. So the way you do that is by attending closely to how a written word is spelled and then linking that sequence of letters to the word's pronunciation and its meaning. So for a very basic example, a child knows the meaning and pronunciation of the word cat. The word gets orthographically mapped to her memory when she links the sounds k, at, to the written word cat. So that requires an awareness of the speech sounds and words, that's phonemic awareness, and it requires an understanding of how those sounds are represented by letters, that's phonics. So you have to have phonemic awareness and phonics to orthographically map words into your long-term memory. And once a word has been orthographically mapped to your memory, you know it instantly on sight. In fact, you cannot suppress your ability to read the word. You don't have to consciously sound it out. You're not decoding the word when you see it. But you know the word instantly because at some point, maybe when you were a little kid in 1st or 2nd grade, you successfully sounded out that word. And you link the spelling of the word in your mind with the meaning and the pronunciation of that word. By about 2nd grade, a typically developing reader who has good phonics skills needs just a few exposures to a word through its pronunciation, its spelling, and its meaning. All those 3 things. And bam, the word is mapped to her memory. And the more words a reader maps to her memory this way, the more she can focus on the meaning of what she's reading. She's not using her brain power to identify the words. She's using her brain power to understand what she's reading, and that is the goal, for readers to understand what they're reading. But when teachers use the cueing system, when they teach those word reading strategies, they are actually impeding the orthographic mapping process. So let me explain this with a story. These are 1st graders in Oakland, California. And a literacy coach who worked with these girls came to see that teaching the cueing system was actually making it harder for many of her students to learn how to read. The coach's name is Margaret Goldberg. She was hired by the Oakland Unified School District in 2015 to teach something called Leveled Literacy Intervention. LLI is a program to help struggling readers. LLI does include some phonics instruction. But the program is rooted in the idea that the letters are one way to figure out a word. So kids are also taught that when they come to a word they don't know, they can use pictures and context to try to come up with a good guess. So Margaret Goldberg started using the LLI program. She started teaching using this program. Around the same time, she found a bunch of unopened materials sitting on a shelf in her school. There are a lot of those in schools. It was a systematic phonics and phonemic awareness program that teaches kids that when they come to a word they don't know, they sound it out. It doesn't teach them the cueing strategies. And in this phonics and phonemic awareness program, beginning readers practice reading in decodable books that contain words with spelling patterns they've been taught. So they don't have to guess the words. They've been taught how to sound them out. Margaret started teaching some of her groups of students LLI with cueing, which is what she was supposed to be doing. And some of her groups, she started teaching the systematic phonics and phonemic awareness program with none of the cueing. And she started to notice differences between the 2 groups of kids. Not just in how well they were reading, but in the way they approached their reading. So she and a colleague recorded 1st graders talking about what makes them good readers. So this is a video, we're gonna play it. Mia is in the white shirt. She was being taught phonics and no cueing, and Jabria in the pink jacket was taught the cueing system.
Readers.
I learn a lot. Because I look at the pictures and I read it.
Ooh. Do you remember when you were little and you didn't know how to read?
Yes.
Like when you started
Kinda.
kindergarten?
Yeah.
What helped you learn how to read? How did you learn?
By looking at the pictures.
Anything else?
Looking at the words and sounding them out.
Right? So Margaret Goldberg was actually seeing this over and over again in her 2 groups of students. So one group was taking away from their reading instruction that reading is about looking closely at words and sounding them out. And the other group of children was learning that when you come to a word you don't know, you don't have to look carefully at the word. and try to connect the spelling with the pronunciation and the meaning. Instead, you can look away from the word. You can look at the pictures, you can look at the other words in the sentence. Basically, you search around for clues to try to help you figure out what the word is. But remember, orthographic mapping, the way you remember those words, requires you to look carefully at words so your brain links the spelling with the sounds and the meaning. And cueing teaches kids to look away from the words. So here's what Margaret Goldberg said to me about the kids in her LLI groups who were being taught the cueing strategies. She said, "I did lasting damage to these kids. It was so hard to ever get them to stop looking at a picture to guess what a word would be. It was so hard to ever get them to slow down and sound a word out, because they had had this experience of knowing that you predict what you read before you read it." So as Margaret was noticing the difference between her two groups of students, she was discovering the scientific research on reading, and it was not stuff she knew or had ever been taught. And she was shocked by what she was learning and how different it was from what the curriculum materials were telling her about how reading works. But what Margaret was learning from the curriculum materials about how reading works is what a lot of teachers are learning about how reading works. So instructional approaches that include cueing are or were all over American classrooms. And not teaching kids how to read the words and teaching them there are other ways to figure out what the words say, this has consequences. So What the Words Say is an article and podcast episode I produced back in 2020, and it starts with a visit to a juvenile detention center in Texas. And you will find an awful lot of struggling readers in detention centers. I went to the juvenile detention center to meet kids who were being taught how to read while they were locked up. And one of the kids that I met was a 17-year-old, Deshaun. And I asked him what he remembered about being taught to read in school. "It was hard," he said. "I didn't understand the words." And I asked what he was learning in his reading lessons while he was in juvenile detention. And he said one of the things he learned is that PH makes the F sound. Like physics, he said. Delighted. I never knew that. So I don't know if Deshaun was taught the cueing strategies, but he didn't learn what he needed to know about how written English works until he was 17 when he was locked in juvenile detention. So these are NAEP scores. Whoops. These are NAEP scores. So that's the National Assessment of Educational Progress, and it's a test that's given every 2 years to a sample of kids across the country in 4th and 8th grade and again in 12th grade. And this slide is representing 4th grade NAEP reading scores before COVID. Before COVID. Things are worse now, but COVID did not cause this problem. The 2019 NAEP scores show that more than a third of all 4th graders could not read at a basic level. So we're not talking about proficiency here, we're talking about basic. More than a third of all 4th graders could not read on even a basic level. And this slide shows the differences among ethnic and racial groups. So the first thing to notice is that more than half of all kids are at basic or below in every subgroup except Asian Pacific Islander, which is close to half at basic or below. And now look at the gaps. And look at that first bar. That represents Black 4th graders. So the 2019 NAEP showed that 82% of Black 4th graders were basic or below in reading. More than 8 in 10. Think about that. A class of 20 Black kids, there are plenty of them here in Washington, D.C. Only 4 of them were proficient readers. When I hear people try to explain these scores, something I almost always hear is poverty. They say poverty is why kids are struggling with reading. And I am not saying that poverty has nothing to do with it. Poverty absolutely plays a role. Everything I've said today, you can see that. It plays a role, especially in the language comprehension side of things, right? But this is much bigger than poverty. First of all, there are more kids struggling with reading than are struggling with poverty. And I think we've been blaming poverty when part of what's going on here has to do with wealth. I say look at these scores and think of wealth. Some kids are lucky enough to be born into families that can take care of the problem if they are not taught how to read in school. They have a safety net, and the safety net is their parents and their parents' checkbooks. Some kids are getting the instruction they need, but a lot of kids aren't. They aren't being taught how to read. This is an equity issue, and it's a civil rights issue. So this is the Soul to Story podcast that I know some of you have heard, and it came out last fall. It's 6 episodes. It's about 4.5 hours of listening, plus there are 2 new bonus episodes that just came out a few weeks ago. And the entire Soul to Story podcast, the entire thing is about one idea, the whole thing, one idea. And the idea is beginning readers don't have to sound out words. They can, but they don't have to, because there are other ways to figure out what the words say. That idea is foundational in balanced literacy. There is usually some phonics instruction, but kids are taught lots of strategies to figure out the words. And balanced literacy is what most schools say they do or said they do. There was a 2020 survey by Education Week, and 72% of K through 2 and special ed teachers said their schools use balanced literacy. Now, balanced literacy sounds really good because balance is absolutely what you want in early reading instruction. A balance between those 2 parts of the simple view of reading, right? The word reading part and the language comprehension part. The problem with balanced literacy is that there's a theory of how kids learn to read the words, and that theory is not right. By telling kids that they can sound out the words, but they don't have to, balanced literacy ends up teaching kids the strategies of struggling readers. Now, some kids are fine because learning to sound out written words isn't that hard for them. A lot of sitting on a parent's lap with books and a little bit of instruction is enough. They figure out pretty quickly that sounding out the words is the most effective and efficient way to know what a word is. Now, they do use context to figure out the meaning of words. This is really important. Good readers do this all the time. You come across a word you don't know, you sound it out. Is that a word I know? Maybe, maybe not. Let me think about what this word might mean based on the context here. This is how good readers use context. But struggling readers are using context all the time, not just to figure out the meanings of words, but to identify the words themselves. Reading is kind of a constant guessing game, and as a result, it's slow, it's taxing, it's hard to focus on the meaning of what you're reading because you're using so much of your brain power just to identify the words. So I will leave you with a reading list because I know this is a room full of readers. This is actually on the Soul to Story website. These are just 10 of the books and articles that have been most helpful to me in understanding all of this. There could be 100 things on this list. Honestly, there's so much good stuff you can read and so many people who are writing about this in a way that's really accessible. So it's at soultostory.org if you want to find that reading list. And I'll just end here going back to the picture of me as a dorky little first grader. So anyone want to guess what year it was? 81, 75, 81, 75. All right, well, 78, 79. Well, Jimmy Carter was running for president. Who's got good political knowledge? 76. It was 76. And here's the thing, I'll tell you something else that was happening in 1976. Cognitive scientists were doing the first experiments that showed the cueing theory was not right. They were pretty sure that was not right by the end of the 1970s. When I look at that picture of myself now, I'm struck by something that I didn't think about before I started doing all this reporting on reading. There's a lot of things I didn't think about. But the school had us pose in front of a shelf of books. This was in the school library. I remember it because I loved the library. They sat us there with our hands on an open book. Now think about how awful that might have been if you were a child who couldn't read. You knew you were supposed to be learning how to read. All kids do in first grade. But you were not learning how to do it. For so many people, this is their first and most guarded secret that they keep for a lot of the rest of their lives. There is a huge amount of pain and suffering that is being caused because kids are not being taught how to read and they're not getting the help they need to figure out how to do it. So thank you so much for being here, for listening. I'm really looking forward to the questions and the conversation we can have as a group. Thank you.
So I thought I could guess because I had that hairdo and I had those glasses.
The glasses, yeah. I think I need another pair of those.
So I've got a couple of questions to get us going, and then very much want to bring you all in. And I think Caitlin actually's got mics that will be able. Perfect.
Sometimes you just can't think of the words.
I know. See, there I was. I'm like freaked out by the whole queuing
Oh
thing.
my gosh. No, that's just aging. That's just an aging brain.
True enough. So I'm really so struck by one, just the science and what you found. The second, as I alluded in my introduction, the form. this idea of podcast, and kind of the irony in some ways of this blockbuster thing about reading, and it's about a math problem. You showed a bunch of pictures, and now you're on a podcast that you're listening to. I just find that quite fascinating. And then you didn't touch on, which I'd like to, the follow-up and what you've heard from people and how intentional you're being about creating a real dialogue about that. So I'd like to sort of ask you one in each. So I think the science of what you found. What about the form? How did you decide? You've got all of this stuff. You started with the podcast form. How did you decide to do that? And then how did you lay it out? Because it's so compelling and it's sort of multimedia.
Oh, I love that you're starting in this nitty-gritty of making a podcast.
Yeah.
We could talk about that all day. So one piece of my background is I've always done radio. We didn't know it as podcasting, but when I first became a reporter, I didn't know what I was doing with my life. I was an English major in college. And so I became an intern at the local public radio station. And I think I was really taken with sound and people's words, and that it was tangible in this way, that somehow, language is so immense, and there's so many words. I was thinking about sort of being a magazine writer, and it was almost like there are too many words to choose from. Let's just have what the people actually said, and we'll start from there. And I'm old enough that it was literally tangible. It was reel-to-reel tape, and we were cutting it up with razors. And so there was something just incredibly tangible, like something just spoke to me about that. So the reason I made a podcast is because that's what I've always loved to do. I've always loved to make audio. The irony, of course, is that I started doing this reporting on reading several years ago, and it always, as I said, existed as a podcast episode and an article. And I thought, well, lots of people will listen, right? Because there's all kinds of people who'll be interested in this, who the reading is not really what they love to do. And in fact, people mostly read the article. And I would spend all my time thinking about how to construct this with sound, and we had millions more people reading than listening. And I thought, well, gosh darn it, we're going to make a podcast and you're not going to be able to read it. There's going to be literally, I had to fight this fight because they want you to sort of make like the web version of it. And I was like, well, first of all, that'll be like a book. I'll wait and I'll do that later. And I don't want people to be able to just read it. And one of the reasons and you can read a transcript, and there actually are people who all they've done is read the transcript, and I think, oh no. But one of the things that I've found is that when people, especially when you're reading things online, people are reading with a certain purpose. They're sort of skimming, and they're sort of looking for what they're looking for. And sometimes it's the confirmation of their own beliefs or the thing they're going to criticize about it or something. There's sort of an intention that we tend to have when we're reading stuff online. And that's different sometimes than when we're just reading a book. I mean, I noticed that when I really want to get engaged and absorbed in even a magazine article, I do not sit at my computer and read it. I buy it and read it, or I print it out. So I think I was noticing, just in terms of how political and that this can get, or how contentious it can get, I just thought, let's just make people listen. Because if you get engaged with the words, hear what people are saying, hear the pain and suffering in their voices, I just think we're going to be able to bring you along and maybe even get some people who might not be so open to this set of information, to this argument that the podcast was making. And I think it's working. I think there are a lot of people who are opening up because they're hearing the emotion in the stories.
It just was stunning to listen to it and to contemplate. I mean, really sort of dense, and how long the science of reading has been around, Reliant and others, and it took a form that wasn't about reading to bust open this conversation.
Well, I think the other thing, just to get into the nitty-gritty of what it takes to write something for the ear, I have just learned over the course of my career, because I'm so interested in writing for the ear and doing things for audio, you have to be very simple. You have to simplify it without, or make it simple without simplifying it. And so it's just something I've had to learn how to do through writing for radio. Because if you lose people's attention, truly when you read, and the research shows this, when you read, you're actually doing a lot of skimming around. Like, you're looking back, you forgot the person's name, you're reading the book, you forget what happened, you sort of nodded off last time, so you go back a few pages or whatever. When you're listening to a podcast, though, when your attention goes away, a lot of times you're gone and you don't come back. And so you have to just bring people along one step at a time, and this stuff really is complex. So that's a long way of saying that I think this research is complex, but there are some simple, important things that people need to understand. And I think I was just able to translate it, almost being forced to translate it to its most simple form, because we were doing it for you to listen to rather than read.
So simplicity on the far side of complexity, right? Not simple-minded, but you have to have a grasp and really understand it in order to be able to simplify it well.
Yeah, that's why I like this. Like I said, it's simple view of reading does not say that reading is simple, but it's a simple way of understanding a complex process. And maybe this podcast was a simple way of understanding something very complex.
Well, and the phenomenon then of the interactivity of having something published online. Talk a little bit about the follow-up. I saw you've got a discussion guide. You and I were talking about the emails and the things you're hearing from people. Talk a little bit about what the follow-up has been.
Sure, yeah, well, there are 2 bonus episodes, and you will hear some, but that's the purpose of them. So a lot of people don't realize that, but they're out there. Yeah, we've gotten a huge amount of response, which I'm not surprised at, but also I've been surprised at sort of the volume of the response, and I'm also really surprised and pleased at how this is really reaching a general audience. So for years, there's been a growing following of parents and increasingly teachers, and often teachers who are parents, because many teachers have their aha moment here when they've been teaching first grade for 10 years, and then their daughter goes to school and she can't read and they don't know how to teach her. And that is quite a moment, I'll tell you. I've had a lot of crying teachers at the other end of my microphone. What was the question again? I feel like I was going somewhere with that.
No, the follow-up. So follow-up and what you're hearing and sort of how that's going.
So we're hearing from a lot of people, yeah. Yeah, we're hearing from a lot of people. We have for a lot of years, but we're hearing, the biggest group of people we're hearing from is teachers. And I'm so happy about that. So it's been parents for years and years and years, but we counted it all up and we put it in a spreadsheet, and the largest group of people are teachers. And we're hearing not a huge amount of pushback. You can find plenty of pushback and resistance if you go looking for it online. When I first started doing this, I got some really hateful emails, people just directly, really very critical. I don't get very many of those anymore. I get some. I get a lot more just angst-filled emails. But also, one of the other things that I've really liked, well, first of all, I've heard from a lot of kids. That's what I really like. Way more, just kids are listening to this. Yeah. You know, there's these little anecdotes like, don't turn that off, Mom. One mom wrote to me, she's like, my kid was playing video games and I was making dinner and I was playing the podcast and he was doing whatever he was doing, and then I turned it off and he's like, wait, what'd you do, Mom? What, you know, and he's like, oh no, he wasn't really playing the video games. He was listening to the podcast. So I love that kids are listening to it, and kids are really recognizing how they were taught. They're like, oh yeah, that's how I was taught how to read. And we're also hearing a lot of examples of people who are really doing something in response. You know, it might be a little thing like going to their school board meeting, or trying to find a way that they can volunteer to teach a kid to read, or getting a book from the library to read more about it. Like, people are writing just about these little actions, and these little actions add up. And we're seeing a lot of response in state legislatures, for better or worse. I have mixed feelings about it.
That was going to be my next question, and then I want to be able to bring in the audience. What do you make of that? I mean, I'm a recovering policy person, and it is a super blunt instrument.
Super.
And yet you also try to get evidence-based policy making. So I mean, you're kind of doing. I suspect you're facing both of those. What do you make of what's happening?
Oh, there's so much to say. Yeah, it's a very. I mean, so if you listen to the podcast and you know history of policy, there have been moments when we've had sort of the blunt force instrument coming down from the top. So we kind of did that during the George W. Bush administration and the Clinton administration. And the Clintons, it became a partisan thing, but it really wasn't, sort of at its origins. And then I would say that was so nasty and fell apart for various reasons, and everyone from policymakers to teachers to journalists were like, let's move on, let's turn a page. We're not going to really think about that. And a lot of things about our policy had us focused on third grade and above, and I would say even higher. We were thinking a lot about college and career readiness and all that kind of stuff. And I really think we sort of forgot about what was happening in K-1, 2. So what's happened is that there's been a really organized movement of parents, a lot of moms, who have really been making this an issue, and social media has really helped them. And so there's been a lot of bottom-up stuff happening. Parents And teachers, increasing number of teachers looking up and being like, whoa, we have a problem here, we need help here, we need something. And now the policymakers are coming in with some answers. But that's always just a very delicate, dangerous little dance right there.
Sure.
So, you know, in an ideal world, you got both. There's like, it's bubbling up, and the people from the bottom are looking up and being like, okay, thank you, yet we need some policy, we need some money, we need some direction, thank you. And now bubbling up will still be like, that policy not so good, like unintended consequences, let's change that. You know, in an ideal world, we'll have this, you know, perfect balance here at the end of the day. But there's going to be mistakes made.
Yeah, for
It's
sure.
not going to work in some places, but what I'm really hoping is that I guess I'll say this. In my email, I am hearing from so many teachers who have had a huge aha and like, oh my gosh, I didn't really know this. I might have had a gut level feeling, many of them did, but I didn't know this. I'm learning it now and I'm trying it and it's working. Like, I have so many more kids who are getting this. The kids that I thought I could never reach, they're learning how to read and they're thrilled by it. When and will we see it in standardized test scores? I don't know. There is a big distance there. There's a lot that goes on in the NAEP scores and all of that. I hope and many states that have made a concerted effort over the years really have seen us move the needle on that. But you know, the language comprehension side and the role of family background, this stuff is huge. And there's a lot more than teaching kids how to read the words that we need to get better at in education. And that is really teaching kids the content and the knowledge and the vocabulary and all that stuff that many kids learn a lot of that stuff not in school. They're spending a lot of their day and they're learning that from the people they talk to and the experiences they have and the fact that they get to go on trips and go to museums and things like that. And they're always going to sort of have an edge there unless we really commit to teaching content in schools. But you know, we fight about the content. Look around. And so this is what we tend to just be like, yeah, let's not really worry about that one. But we kind of need to engage in that because that's a huge part here of becoming a really good reader is the stuff you know.
I thought your discussion about your explanation of the equation about what happens, you know, zero, and that those two things are products. I didn't. That was a great visual. I didn't get that.
It's very important. It's a very important. That's a huge. It was a huge. That I always talk about the simple view of reading, and it drives some people nuts because, you know, there's a lot more to it, and sure, it's more complex than that. But that's the reason why it stood the test of time. It explains something that is true about reading. And it is a huge aha for so many people to understand that. It just puts the things we've been fighting about into perspective. Like, wait a minute, why are we fighting about teaching kids how to decode the words? What? We have to do that.
Right.
We have to do that.
So I'd like to open up for questions. Yes, we go there and then here in front.
So I'm with a group of teachers.
I think maybe there's a microphone.
Is there a
Hold on
mic? I think we have a mic so that we can, yeah, thank you.
I'm from a group of teachers from Arlington Public Schools, and a lot of us felt like what you're describing in your emails. We were doing what we were taught, we were using the materials that we were given, and it just wasn't working. And a lot of us started stepping into science of reading when COVID hit.
Yep.
And we were teaching kids at home, and we needed things to help them when they were not in school. So I would say we're all converts. The thing I think a lot of us see now is that our college and universities aren't preparing teachers to hit the ground running to help children learn to read. So it's great that legislators are saying use these curriculums and all those things, but our state universities aren't there yet. And how do we make an impact there in changing what teachers are taught and how that experience impacts kids' learning?
Yeah. Well, it's a really good question, and it's an important part of the equation. And I would say it's an important thing that actually has been talked about and discussed and put on the table as like a big issue. And, you know, for better or worse, and I might make some people angry or whatever, but there has been a decent amount of resistance in schools of education. Not all, there are definitely exceptions. But some of the ideas that I talked about really came from within and sort of became popular within schools of education, while all this sort of scientific research about how kids learn to read was happening across the quad in the psychology department and over with the neuroscientists, and these groups don't talk to each other. And then all of a sudden there's all these findings from the research that say something different and actually really truly contradict a lot of the really like closely held beliefs, and that's threatening for good reason, right? So I actually think that I am not dismissing exactly what you're saying, but I think a lot of people have been trying to get traction in schools of education for a long time, and it hasn't gone so well. And the truth is that if we fixed all of the colleges of education right now, we still have a big problem, which is all the teachers who are out there now. And you only can learn so much before you're prepared to go into any profession. Teacher education, I think, is not done very well just overall. We have lots of data that show us that. But no matter what you're being prepared for, you all know that you learn a lot of what you need to know on the job. So I felt like it was actually really important to get inside what teachers are learning over 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. And the most heartbreaking emails I get are from the teacher like, I've been teaching for 32 years and I'm learning this for the first time. But the hopeful thing at the end of some of those emails is, but I am recommitted. I am not retiring yet, and I am going to teach some kids to read based on this new knowledge, darn it, and I'm doing it. And that is awesome. So, but it is a problem that needs to be solved. And ultimately, what I think will start to happen is as schools, ultimately it'll be a supply and demand thing. School districts saying, we're not hiring teachers from your university, and that's happening. They're like, you're not training your teachers, so we're not hiring them. And I think that's what will eventually really change the game. And like I said, all of this happens too where someone starts doing something different and it's working well and people start to look to them. So there are places that are really changing things, and I think that will start to turn the tide.
And maybe be a little more like viral as opposed to, okay, we'll change the curriculum in ed schools.
Yes.
Yes, we had right up here, sir.
Hi, I'm also a teacher, and I have kind of two main worries. I would say I also am very convinced by the research. It's very clear. I was trained in balanced literacy. It's very clear that though we've always been teaching some phonics, we're not teaching it effectively or systematically, and that I have both used and not used the cueing system, and it doesn't work. But my two worries are that, one, school districts and policymakers are very reactive, and I think tonight you were very nuanced about the difference between balanced literacy and whole language, but the media I've seen hasn't really been. It's sort of like phonics or not phonics. And we're very afraid in my school that the pendulum is going to swing way too far and we're only going to teach phonics. And part of why we love teaching is that we love teaching literature. And so how do we make sure that kids are still being exposed to books that aren't decodable readers? So that's part of it. And the other part is I teach elementary English language learners. So what do you know about the research for kids for whom decoding these phonetic sounds then don't have that meaning because it's not their first language?
Well, I'll take the first part. I think you're right. I see it all the time. And I was just being interviewed for someone else's podcast this morning, and everyone just sort of wants to reduce this to phonics. And again, if you listen to Sold a Story, what you realize is the point is, yes, there is some phonics being taught, but there's this other idea that has been competing with it, that has sort of I think kind of impeded teachers' sort of full understanding of why phonics is important. So the most important thing here is the knowledge, the why, teachers understanding the why and the how, and everyone understanding that how do kids learn to read? Which kind of, things will not go well. Things are already not going well in a lot of places, but I think there's enough interest among teachers to get this right and to be really engaged in the nuances of it all that I think we might be headed in a better direction on this one. And when it comes to English language learners, I know there's a certain amount of sort of debate. There's a certain sort of fear that there's this is a zero-sum game here. And I think that's because sometimes in education it is a little bit of a zero-sum game. There's only so much money, so much time in the day, whatever, right? But just look at the simple view of reading equation and just think about how that applies to English language learners. So or just think of how it applies to you who's learning a language. You know how to read and speak English. You're learning another alphabetic language. So you can I could learn to decode Spanish, but I could read it all and not have any idea what I'm saying because I don't have the language comprehension. So I think the fear among the English language learner advocacy community is that it's going to swing so far to phonics and we're going to forget about the language comprehension, which is absolutely critical for English language learners, but it's absolutely critical for a lot of kids, not just English language learners. So I think it's just about people like you continuing to push back in the right ways. And it's really, whenever I get a chance to be in front of audiences of mostly policymakers, I just like, listen to your teachers. You are putting these policies into place. Are they meeting the needs? Are they answering? What's not going well on the ground? How are you going to change that policy so that it works better?
Thank you. Keep telling them to listen to teachers.
Okay.
No, for sure. Well, even the false binary that so often happens when I say policies at blunt instrument, phonics, yes or no, phonics good or bad, as opposed to, I think, the way that you described it, which is this is how this works in the brain.
Well, we've gotten into trouble here too because it was like phonics good, phonics bad, and then balanced literacy is like, no, phonics not bad. We're going to do some phonics, and everyone's like, everything's fine here, right? And you're like, oh, wait a minute, not everything's fine. We didn't actually along the way help equip enough teachers to really understand reading and how it works, and why some kids struggle, and what they all need to learn to become better readers.
I think, let's see, sir, yes. And then you have the green. Thank you.
The woman with the mic has the power.
Hi, I'm Jimmy Williams. I'm with the Washington Literacy Center. So we focus on the other spectrum, the adults who didn't get any of that. So what you say resonates because most of the people we have, they have those barriers that you are talking about. But my question is, hearing what you're saying about the balanced approach to literacy, is we now have, in the District of Columbia, for example, there's over 119,000 people reading below the first grade. But how do we get the reinforcement not to have another generation that is interrupted in the same way? And how do you advise someone where the parents don't have that skill and the literacy skill, and the teachers are teaching, as I've heard back there, but at home there is nothing almost. So the reinforcements that's necessary is a struggle. And finally, I noticed that we have an increase of people who want services that we can't provide for their youth and for those children. So it's kind of a conundrum in trying to even balance that, to save, save the parents and then struggle for reinforcement. So I know it's a lot packed into this, but it's something that we struggle with every day. And next to me, she's with Friends of the Library, so we're talking all about how do we really make something out of this.
Yeah, well, there is a lot there, and I think obviously the home and what kids are getting at home is hugely important, right? And this is where sort of it's like a huge advantage to a kid to come into school with lots of language comprehension, lots of having already been read to at home. I think, though, that we really have, as a society writ large, sort of believed, really, when you get down inside what the beliefs are, like I've written a few things for the New York Times, and when I look at the readers' comments, and when there's other things written, I see this over and over again. I'm like, oh my God, the New York Times readers really believe this one. They really believe that it's actually the parents' responsibility to teach kids how to read, that it's not really the job of the school. And I think we've done a good enough job helping people understand how important it is to teach kids to read to kids, right? I'm not saying all parents are getting the message or have the resources or ability or the books in the home, but I do think that message is out there. But I think it's almost, that message needs to continue to get out there, but it almost takes away the responsibility from the schools. Because reading tons to kids is not enough for all kids. There's a decent number of kids it's not enough for. You can read to them till the cow jumps over the moon, and they are not going to become good readers unless you teach them how to do it. So I think we've absolved the schools of some responsibility. And again, I really do think there's a deep belief about that. And I think we need to just get the message more out that the schools have a responsibility to teach kids how to read. But there's a big parent responsibility there too, of course. And the message to everyone is, the best thing you can do to get your kid off to a good start with reading is read to them a lot. But believe me, my whole journey in this started with the parents who were like, I've been reading to that kid since I was pregnant with him, and he can't read. So what's going on?
I think our last, yes, thank you. Last question. Right? All right. Oh, I'm second to last question. No.
I have spent most of my life as a principal, so I'm standing. And I really can't help it. And I've been a principal of 2 middle schools and 2 high schools, so I have never taught elementary school. But I'm a parent and a grandparent, and I know what you're saying is so true. I also know that you've got to educate from the bottom up and the top down. We live in Washington, D.C., where you have the National Principals Association for elementary schools, every other level. You have the National School Boards Association. You have the National PTAs Association. If I were running a school, I would want you to come and speak to the PTA and any parent who would come. I would want you to speak to all the principals in Fairfax County, where I was a principal. And we've got to educate everyone. And we do a lot of professional development. I've actually been on the Board of Visitors of James Madison University and talked to the Dean of Education. And I know the silos. But anyway, they all have conventions.
Well, I've been to some of them. I was at the Maryland Elementary School Principals Association meeting a few weeks ago, and I was in Fairfax County speaking to all the middle and high school teachers. They had a one-day convention, and they were very interested in this. I think that's another really important part of this.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Bravo. I really appreciate it.
And there was another event here earlier, and that was the School Board Association and the Chief State School Officers, and there's the film that, I don't know if you saw that, but all those groups have seen that film. It's been a lot of their national conventions, so we're doing our best to help educate them.
So last question right up here in front. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. I work for an educational publishing company, and we've been doing this work since 2005, trying to get lessons based on the science into the classrooms, and we're so excited that this movement is finally picking up speed. But we know that even though there are so many kids that this work is helping right now in the younger grades, and states are passing laws and teachers and parents are being convinced that we need to change the way we're teaching reading, there are so many parents of older kids now who are out there thinking, well, this is great. It explains why my fourth grader or my seventh grader or my 12th grader can't read, but how do I fix it for these kids? We can't turn the clock back for them. So what can we do? And particularly troubling is that often the standards, the educational standards that teachers use, that schools use to design their lessons and everything, the word study and the phonics and all, it's totally gone after third grade.
Yeah.
So, it doesn't need to be there anymore for the kids that have learned it. And a lot of these kids are going to learn it now. But what do we do for those adolescents who, it's a little too late? We needed Sold a Story, like 10 years ago.
Well, yeah, it's difficult. I get these emails all the time, and it's some of the most difficult questions. I'll just add a few thoughts. One, I think one of the things that a lot of people are understanding is that kids who are struggling, like after about third or fourth grade, when a kid is struggling with reading, it's always like, well, he has a comprehension problem. And well, why does he have a comprehension problem? A lot of times, not always, it's because they really, really can't deal with the words very quickly, very efficiently, very accurately. So I think part of it is just recognizing what the problem is. Then it's a big thing, what do you do about it? When do you do it? In the school day. There's no time in the school day. Who's going to do it? Who's going to teach? With what materials? With what kind of appropriate? Now, there is stuff out there, I can't name them, but there are good programs, there are good assessments. But I think it really is recognizing that word level problems really are the most common and most debilitating source of reading problems. And when you have a word reading problem, you end up having language comprehension problems because you are not learning a lot of most of what we learn about language is through reading. And if you get off to a bad start with that, then it's exponential in nature, right? And of course, the other thing that's just really important to recognize for older kids and adults is that this is a real emotional issue for them, right? So you really have to deal with the fact that they are going to resist you in a lot of cases. Other people have, this is a secret. They feel a tremendous amount of shame, a tremendous amount of anxiety. There's just a lot of emotional stuff that needs. So we really do need to prevent these problems from happening. But we got a lot of people who we need to help them now. And they can be helped. So the last thing is, what all of this research shows is that you can be taught to read at any age. It is never too old to be taught how to read. And I have met a number of people who were in their 40s and 50s who were taught how to read. And to tell you the truth, good instruction, they can be taught to read pretty quickly. There are just some really basic insights they never had about how the words are made up of parts that are sounds, and that these letters, they just didn't have that insight. It's amazing when you have had that insight. It seems so obvious. But when you haven't had the insight, literally you have to just tell someone, really, that's how it works? Now start showing me. You start showing them, you get them started, and then it is all about, it's all about sort of statistical learning. You are actually teaching yourself a lot, but you have to get started. And if you don't get a good start, sometimes you just never go, and then you resist it. Not going. I've got my ways. I know how. I've got my ways of getting through text. I guess things. I get the gist of it. I fake it. I call my girlfriend. You know, this is what people do.
We'll keep talking to middle and high school teachers and principals, because that's a real avenue.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for coming.
This was just terrific. I mean, it just, I'm just, as I said in the introduction, just blown away by the series. But just even the way you talk about it now, the simplicity on the far side of complexity, taking this 30 years, 40 years of science and turning it into a single insight that seems really actionable. The podcast form, I'm a convert. And be sure to listen.
There's a lot of good podcasts out there. I'll tell you about them.
But the kids' voices, when you have them reading at the end, it's genius. I highly recommend it. And then this follow-up, which is coming to places like this, to going to conventions. It's just it's a massive contribution to education. And so thank you for being here, and thank you for the work you do.
Thank you.
Thank you.